It's my pleasure to introduce Reverend Dr. Jim Miller. We have a long, well, okay, maybe not long. We have a fantastic, I think, tradition at SSA conferences and leadership summits of having a minister. And we are keeping in that tradition this time around. We are going to be having Jim Miller talk to us about his perspectives on the interplay of faith and religion and how those work together in terms of teaching about them in a secular state. And he certainly brings a perspective that is both a little bit different than the one that we might usually have, and also still very reputable. He is a co-chair of the broader social impact committee of the Human Origins Program at the Smithsonian's Natural History Museum. And he also serves as, and has served since its beginning in 1992, on the Presbyterian Association of Science, Technology, and the Christian Faith. And he is retired in good standing, honorably retired, like being honorably discharged from the military,
right.
I guess, Presbyterian minister. So with that, I will let you welcome him.
Thanks. Let's see here. We'll try this. Let's see. This is actually probably a much more image that characterizes mainline Christianity than it does anything else, and reflects the kind of divided world in which most mainline religious folks live today. I'll come back and talk about that in a little bit more. What I'd really like to talk about is going beyond the politics. The politics is very important. One of my good friends, Jeannie Scott, is actively involved in encouraging folks around the country through the National Center for Science Education to speak out and to support those political and legal actions that are necessary in order to maintain the integrity of public science education. And I laud her for that work. But one of the ongoing discussions we have is, I've always suggested that's a little bit like treating a disease, the symptoms of a disease. That is, the problem is that you may be very successful in reducing the symptom, but what you may not do is do anything about the nature of the disease. And part of the problem is we need to find ways of seeking cures and or at least immunization. So that, as a matter of fact, we have less and less instances of these sorts of outbreaks. So what I'm going to offer you today is three personal observations that try to convey to you the way in which this particular individual, who is scientifically trained, although not with a university degree in science. I started out as an undergraduate student to become an engineer, and through my junior year, until I decided to go to seminary, and I need to learn how to read and write. And so went ahead and finished in an American Studies curriculum. Thought I was going to have a church career until I had my last year in seminary, and ended up going to do an internship at North Carolina State University in the School of Engineering there. And I've been up to my eyebrows in science and religion stuff ever since. But what I'm going to offer you some personal observations, which you may or may not agree with, but at least maybe give you something to think about. The first one is that in America there's no long-term protection of public science education without believers. And I don't mean that any hard political sort of sense, except just the demographics of it. The 2008 American Religious Identity Survey shows that if you lump together Roman Catholics, who make up about 25% of the American population, along with Baptists, you've got probably a third or more of the population there, along with mainline Christians. And of course, with the Baptists, it's varieties of Baptists. It's not just one kind of Baptist. A variety of mainline churches, you've got over 50%. Or to show this in somewhat more starkly, over 75% of the adult American population identifies with one or another form of Christianity. If you're going to address the integrity of public science education, these are folks that need to be taken account of. Because regardless of your political success over the long run on any particular case or instance, in the long run, if this community in some way is not engaged in a positive sort of way to support such education, the likelihood is that it's always going to be in jeopardy in one way or another. The second thing is that the issue is not belief versus knowledge or secular versus sacred or faith versus reason. It is which faith or belief is held, how reason will be used, and what knowledge means. Now, if you go out, and this has been my experience, if I go out and ask folks in the public in general, how do you see the relationship between science and religion? The most common response I get, it's one of conflict. And it's easy to hear voices in the public that affirm that. In fact, the media loves the voices that affirm that. So, for instance, I'm in favor of a dialogue between science and religion, but not a constructive one. One of the great achievements of science has been, if not to make it impossible for intelligent people to be religious, then at least to make it possible for them not to be religious. We should not retreat from this accomplishment. Those are the words of Nobel laureate Steven Weinberg from a book called Cosmic Questions. It's always been interesting with Stephen because he once declared that there was no really first-class scientist who was also a traditionally religious believer. And he actually shared the Nobel Prize with Abdus Salam, who is a devout Muslim. It is fashionable to wax apocalyptic about the threat of humanity posed by the AIDS virus, mad cow disease, and many others, but I think a case can be made that faith is one of the world's great evils, comparable to the smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate. Some of you will probably know that quote by Richard Dawkins. And Richard is probably one of the best popularizers of a basic understanding of evolutionary processes and evolutionary science in the English language. Nevertheless, he does clearly have this sense that an acceptance of science undermines one's ability to, in fact, to affirm a religious perspective. Now, it's interesting that on the other side, you have voices that actually agree. The American public has largely been duped into thinking that by not mentioning God or the Bible, something like the Smithsonian is being neutral. But there is no neutral position. One is either for Christ or against. This museum is imposing a religion on generations of American, the religion of atheism. It's the same worldview that is being thrust at generations of children in the public schools. And these are the words of Ken Ham, who is, as you know, the founder of the Creation Museum. And these are comments he made online following the opening of the Human Origins exhibit, the new Human Origins exhibit at the Smithsonian. A somewhat more sophisticated view, but no less adamant in the view that mainline science, mainstream science, is inimical to traditional religion, are these. Naturalism does not explicitly deny the mere existence of God, but it does deny that a supernatural being could in any way influence natural events, such as evolution, or communicate with natural creatures like ourselves. Scientific naturalism makes the same point by starting with the assumption that science, which studies only the natural, is our only reliable path to knowledge. A God who can never do anything that makes a difference, and of whom we can have no reliable knowledge, is of no importance to us. And these are the words of Philip Johnson, who is sort of the godfather of the intelligent design movement, and I'm afraid to say is also a Presbyterian elder. We all have embarrassing members of our family. I mean, that's now, what I would say is this is the tone that you often get in an awful lot of the public discourse about science and religion that you see in the media. But I've found that if I ask most folks, well, okay, fine, but what do you think about it? Then what I'm much more likely to get is this, that they see that science and religion are basically separated from one another. Now, this is actually a long, this position has a long and philosophically venerable standing. It at least has its origins in the philosophical works of René Descartes and Immanuel Kant in the 17th and 18th centuries. But you don't have to go back that far to find it. When John Paul II addressed the Pontifical Academy of Sciences in 1996 on the matter of evolution, he reflected a dualist view. And somewhat after that, commenting on that, in an article that appeared in Natural History, titled Non-Overlapping Magisteria, Stephen Jay Gould wrote these words: "The lack of conflict between science and religion arises from a lack of overlap between their respective domains of professional expertise. Science in the empirical constitution of the universe, and religion in the search for proper ethical value and the spiritual meaning of our lives." Basically, it's a point of view that says, on the one hand, you have matter and body and facts and objects and reason, physics and technology, and the secular. On the other, you have spirit, mind, soul, faith, values, subjects, passion, metaphysics, art, sacred, an impermeable barrier between them, which places, of course, science on one side and religion on the other. It's what I've sometimes referred to as the Robert Frost theory of the relationship between science and religion. Strong walls make good neighbors. What I suggest is that actually over the last 100 or so years, perhaps even a little bit longer than that, there's been developing an alternative, which for lack of a better description, I'm going to call asymmetrical interactionism. It sees science and religion as different things, but nevertheless bearing upon one another in influential ways, but at different places. So that what's emerging is a view that these areas are related to one another in a much more complex fashion. In fact, it's not nearly that simple. It's probably not that simple either. Now, the third thing I want to suggest is that our observation is accepting science is not religiously neutral. Now, most of you have probably seen this cartoon. It's one of my favorite Harris cartoons. We live in a time in which it is absolutely the case that it is not credible for religions to say, well, you don't understand this, I'll give you the answer, based on some sort of conviction out of the religious tradition, an understanding of the world out of the religious tradition. That simply is not going to fly anymore. In fact, many theologians who have thought about these matters would agree. That is, that the idea of the God of the gaps is dead. Not the least of which is because historically science continues to fill gaps. But this is not a new idea. You probably heard this quote: "Often a non-Christian knows something about the earth, the heavens, and the other parts of the world, about the motions and orbits of the stars and even their sizes and distances, and this knowledge he holds with certainty from reason and experience. It is thus offensive and disgraceful for an unbeliever to hear a Christian talk nonsense about such things, claiming that what he is saying is based in Scripture. We should do all that we can to avoid such an embarrassing situation, which people see as ignorance in the Christian and laugh to scorn." Now, that comes from the 5th century. From Augustine, from a work that was entitled The Literal Meaning of Genesis. Now, that's a quote that gets quoted an awful lot these days. My friend Ken Miller, who wrote Finding Darwin's God, that was where I first discovered this quote. It was in this work. He's not related to me. I claim him, but we're not related. But I found another quote that I shared with him, also from Augustine. "God, the author and creator of all natures, does nothing contrary to nature. For whatever is done by him, who appoints all natural order and measure and proportion, must be natural in every case." This, it seems to me, is grounds for developing a theism that's fully naturalistic, that does not require reference to the supernatural. Now, for me, the most articulate expression of the challenge that faces most religion, and certainly mainline religion, of which I'm a part, is the following. When we speak of a theology of modern science, it obviously does not mean that by itself science can determine an image of God and a religion. But what it does mean, if I am not mistaken, is that given a certain development of science, certain representations of God and certain forms of worship are ruled out as not being homogeneous with the dimensions of the universe known to our experience. This notion of homogeneity is without doubt of central importance in intellectual, moral, and mystical life, even though the various stages of our interior life cannot be expressed strictly in terms of one another. On the other hand, they must agree in scale, in nature, and tonality. Otherwise, it would be impossible to develop a true spiritual unity in ourselves, and that is perhaps the most legitimate, the most imperative, and the most definitive of the demands made by man of today and man of tomorrow. These are the words of the Jesuit paleontologist Teilhard de Chardin, written in personal correspondence in the 1920s and published in 1947. I think he articulates very, very clearly here the challenge that most mainline religion faces, and I'm talking about mainline religion, whether you're talking about Christian, certainly the Abrahamic traditions, face in addressing themselves to the findings of contemporary science over the last 450 years. I'll also say, though, it's not only a matter of accepting science as not religiously neutral, nor is it philosophically neutral. And here I'd offer as evidence, as opinion at any rate, the following. We must now recognize belief once more as the source of all knowledge. Tacit assent and intellectual passions, the sharing of an idiom and of cultural heritage, affiliation to a like-minded community, such are the impulses which shaped our vision of the nature of things on which we rely for our mastery of things. No intelligence, however critical or original, can operate outside such a fiduciary framework. And these are the words of Michael Polanyi, a physical chemist, Hungarian physical chemist, who eventually came to England and offered reflections on the history and philosophy of science. And this comes from his work in 1962 called Personal Knowledge. To say this in short terms, you can't know anything unless you believe something first. That is, reason needs to have something to work on, but it doesn't provide itself with its own starting point. Karl Popper understood this too. It was over against the positivists. He argued that you cannot, through some process of induction, generate good theories. What you do is you begin with the imagination creating a hypothesis, which then reason can assess as to its adequacy or not before the evidence and so forth. Another quote that I think is great in this regard, it has something to do with the limits of our knowledge, comes from J.B.S. Haldane. He had a great series of one-liners. This is just one of them I'm going to mention. Haldane, as you may know, is one of the founders of population genetics and the modern evolutionary synthesis. And he wrote in his own inimical English way, "My own suspicion is that the universe is not only queerer than we suppose, it's queerer than we can suppose." Or to say it in a more Americanese, it's not only stranger than we imagine, it's stranger than we can imagine. Which is to say, not that the exercise of reason is futile, but rather that there's always going to be more upon which reason can, as a matter of fact, ponder. That there will be a never-ending effort to try to understand what the world is like. "I don't believe in God," she said. "Which God don't you believe in?" I asked. When she answered, I concurred that I did not believe in that God either, but suggested that there were more possibilities than the one she identified, and wondered whether she had checked them all out. Back in the early 50s, maybe late 40s, Charles Hartshorne and William Rees wrote this remarkable book called Philosophers Speak of God. In it, they identified 10 distinct forms of theism, 6 classical views, and 4 modern views. They also identify 4 distinct forms of skepticism. The point I would make is that these are all religious perspectives. One of the things I find very, very fascinating is the way in which there is a sense that to be secular is not to be religious. That seems very odd to me. And I'll tell you why. And the reason is because the way I define religious. So here are some definitions. And I think actually the adjective religious is the primitive term. I think that's the term you begin with, and then the other terms are defined in relationship to it. The religious for me is anything dealing with the meaning of personal passage. Religions then are historical institutions, social traditions, systems of belief and practice that sustain and perpetuate a particular interpretation of the meaning of personal passage. And finally, theology in the generic sense is reflection upon, construction of, and articulation of a particular interpretation of the meaning of personal passage. Now, you may have noticed that there's a phrase that keeps repeating there, personal passage. And what do I mean by that? Well, all I mean is the living of a person in her existential, interpersonal, social, cultural, global, cosmic, evolutionary, historical context. It's just us living our lives where we are. That's all that I mean by personal passage. And what I'm suggesting is, for me at any rate, the term religious applies to anything that has to do with the meaning of that. Which is to say that a non-theist, to the extent that they have anything that you would call a philosophy of life, actually is being religious. They may not be a member of any identifiable religion, because that's that social, historical sort of thing. The chances are, though, given that they're human beings and we're very social creatures, they probably do affiliate around that tradition of meaning, which means they actually have something like a religion. And to the extent that they actually write about such things in some sort of careful, systematic, articulate way, then generically they probably have something like theology as well. Now, I don't say this in order to kind of reach out and grab y'all and say, well, let's just have a group hug. No, all I'm saying, though, is that I think it's important in terms of our language not to misunderstand the fact that we may all be, as a matter of fact, by virtue of our own development as Homo sapiens, engaged in one way or another in similar reflections. It gives it gives us a common ground to relate to one another, it seems to me, even though our particular answers may be quite different. So I just want to end quickly with 3 suggestions. I'm -1 already.
It's okay.
And these are just suggestions. Assume that believers are potential allies in efforts to ensure the integrity of public science education, and seek them out. Become more nuanced about the necessity of belief for knowledge, the limits of reason, the diversity of beliefs, and the moral implications of knowledge. And finally, accept that in an evolving, deeply mysterious universe, all hearts and minds need to be open to change at the most basic level. Thank you very much.
If you want to entertain a couple of questions, we can.
Do you see scripture and dogma playing any useful part in this search for knowledge in various forms?
Scriptures are literary traditions that inform a particular community, that convey for a particular community what the roots of their understanding or interpretation of the meaning of personal passage, to use the language I was using earlier. Most communities that would be identified as religious communities have some body of text that is definitive for them. But the whole notion of biblical inerrancy in terms of the Christian tradition is a relatively modern invention. It's not an old idea. As you can see, going back to Augustine, that was clear that that there were ways of interpreting Scripture in the face of experience and reason that didn't deny the truthfulness of Scripture, but simply said you had to interpret it in a different way. In terms of dogma, systematic reflection on one's beliefs and arriving at things that the community can agree on about such things is a valuable, I think, social process. Worshipping those rather than their source, which is only partially captured by whatever you may have said, is what in Judaism and Christianity would be called idolatry. So to the extent that one substitutes, I've often said that all systematic theologians out of necessity violate the second commandment. That is to say, they don't make graven images out of material stuff, they make idols out of words. So there's as great a risk, religious risk, of worshiping our words about God as opposed to God. I have another slide that I sometimes use. This comes out of contemporary philosophy, post-Kantian and Wittgensteinian philosophy. It shows a picture of a pipe, and it says, "This is not a pipe." And then it points to the word pipe. "This is not a pipe either." And then I show up a picture of God. I said, "This is not God, but neither is the word God." And the point is that whatever we say, and I also would want to say that this is true about science too. Science provides us reliable knowledge, but I think Kant was absolutely right. All of our science, all of our knowledge is mediated to us. We don't know things in themselves. We know it only as it's mediated to us, and we test the reliability of our knowledge. But any scientist worth their salt is going to tell you that it's not likely that you're going to have a scientific revolution that's going to overturn everything that's been known in the past. But it may very well transform what is known in the past in terms of an entirely new understanding of what the world's like. That certainly is what happened in the historic revolution between classical mechanics and relativity quantum thought.
All right. Okay.
Can I have the PowerPoint?
Sure.
I like it. I
Quick.
want it.
Oh, yeah.
So the PowerPoints will be, we're going to put them in the YouTube videos we put up. I realize it's not quite as convenient, but, well, I don't know about...
Well, if you want to give me your email address, I'll be glad to send it to you. Oh, shucks.
You look so eager.
Would you say that there's a substantial religious portion, especially in the youth, that would be open to considering themselves our allies?
Yeah, I think so. Someone mentioned, I guess, earlier that they had had some experience in relating to one of the other campus Christian organizations. It happened to be Presbyterian, but I think any of the mainline religious communities are likely to be potential allies. Just ask them and see. I mean, on any particular project or effort.
I mean, specifically for things that would have to do with science. Because
sure.
As far as just like outreach programs or like charities, it's fairly easy to get with a religious organization because it's coming together.
There are within the main, again, I use mainline. This would be Presbyterians, UCCs, Disciples, Methodists, Episcopalians. Actually, the Lutherans, the Episcopalians, the UCCs, and the Methodists, to some degree, all have initiatives of one kind or another at the denominational level or in relationship to their denominations in science and religion. And all of these initiatives are affirmative of the basic findings of science and recognize the need for their religious communities to take account of those findings in the life of that community. One of the best resources right now that's actually up on web is called the Catechism of Creation that was produced by the Episcopalians. If you use that, Google it under that, Catechism of Creation. It shows the way in which one particular Protestant Christian community has tried to engage the whole domain of evolution, as well as what has now come to be called earth care or creation care.
Huh.
So it's an example of the way in which churches have tried to do this.
All right, we've got to move on to pure problem solving now, but thank you very much.
Oh, you're quite welcome.